the people who put their faith in Trump put it in him because he is a fighter, okay? And the thing about the nature of his election is in taking on the establishment Republicans, the establishment Dems, the Washington political power class, which is what he's now up against. You don't get to decide how hard and how long the fight's going to be. No soldier who jumps out of an airplane on a battlefield knows when the fight's over. And I think you have to go into this fight recognizing that it's a fight.
We're the insurgents now in many ways. We're insurgents in our own homeland. And if anything, I think President Trump needs to embrace his role as the leadership in it. And I believe he's going to get reelected, and when he does on November 4th, I think you're going to see him move very deliberately to take the country in the direction it needs to go.
We may see the best second term of a president. Normally, the first term of a president is strong. They come in with fire in their belly, and they put their people in place, and they get a lot accomplished. The second term is, sometimes a letdown because the deep state empire strikes back. In this case, with President Trump, it may be the opposite. If the first term had too much of the empire in it, the second term, he now is fully aware of the problem, and he may just clean house and put phenomenal people, and we may see the best second term of a president in the history of this country.
I think so too. I mean, we have a long way to go, and I hope your audience is in for the fight.
Not everything in the war on terrorism is kinetic. We fixate, we Westerners, I think it has something to do with our affinity for guns and Westerns, and we appreciate that culturally. So when we think about the enemy in the war on terrorism, we think about the guy carrying the AK-47, or we thinking about the guy carrying the suicide bomber vest. We don't think about the subversive who is working at a school that is revising texts or curriculum informing future U.S. government leaders. I think the public would be surprised at the level to which PC, politically correctness, is weaponized and enforced inside particularly the intelligence community.
Tell me about the Obama years. What was it like in the deep state then?
A clear political agenda put upon everything. It was amazing seeing the levels to which the Obama administration would dig down into the bureaucracy. And, in some administrations, you'll see the generals are pressured by the politicians and maybe the senior executives are pressured. But in the Obama administration, that pressure made its way well down into the system so that everybody felt it. And anyone who didn't comport with the party line knew that their career was going to be placed in jeopardy by these political appointees during those years. It was really kind of frightening, to be honest with you. It was profoundly un-American.
Well, you saw the purge happen. You saw all these brilliant military officers being forced out because they didn't agree with political matters that had nothing to do with the military.
Right, Kevin. It wasn't just that they didn't agree with political matters per se. It's that the political matters themselves became ideologically driven. And so, just seeking the truth or seeking the facts, even in, organizations chartered to do just that, for example, the intelligence community, if you were a fact seeker, you would be punished. If you wanted to speak, factually on China, you would be punished. If you wanted to speak factually on Islam or jihad, you would be punished.
So we saw with the purge directed at the FBI and Department of Defense, and candidly the entire national security apparatus in 2011, moving to remove terms that, while the president can say it's a political talking point, in reality, it is the complete strategic collapse of the intelligence process. And so what you see happen on that is, for example, in Afghanistan, where we had what they called green on blue attacks, the indigenous forces that we were working with were turning and shooting our guys on the ground. We weren't able to see that coming. We had situations where Private First Class Abdo, who was on Al Jazeera in his army uniform, espousing the exact same political rhetoric, that Nidal Hassan had espoused. And when he was identified by my colleagues and I as somebody that needed to be looked at, we were screamed at for being racist. We were called xenophobes. And then within 6 months of that series of incidents taking place, Abdo was basically, his plot was interrupted by an alert gun store owner outside Fort Hood, where he was planning to go into a follow-on attack at Fort Hood in 2012. PFC Abdo is now serving life in prison for planning a terrorist attack at Fort Hood. Most Americans don't realize this. So removing the terms collapses your entire deliberate decision-making process, and it blinds you. It's a purposeful maneuver by our enemy to blind us strategically in the war on terrorism. When you begin to attack our history, all right, when you attack the founders, for example, because the cultural norm at the time included slavery. I had an ancestor that fought on the side of the North in the Civil War. I don't have any issue with personal guilt about the issue of slavery. Right? And this cultural attempt to kind of impart that upon people, you see it in the public school system, you see it in the culture now. It's really it's a direct attack against those foundational documents and the ideas of those men. And so when the president, I think, accurately depicts the situation in Charlottesville, where ideologues from both the left and the right are channeling people to violent action against one another, and he comes in and he calls them both out, he is doing a heroic service, and he is pilloried in the media for this. And it is a reflection of the cultural Marxist memes that drive today's national media. And I think the American public needs to become aware of that. And my personal opinion is that they are aware of it. They may not be able to articulate what they see in terms of the political warfare or political science rhetoric, etc., but they feel it. So trust their instincts. And recognize that the vestiges of America today still are as strong as ever. You see it in baseball, you see it in the homeschooling movement, you see it in the people who came out who hadn't voted in decades in some cases and voted for President Trump, who realized we need to move away from these ideologies. The entire form of government that the founders created depends upon reason and critical thinking. Without it, it will not work anymore. And when you see ideologues on both sides, whether they be white supremacists or hardcore Marxist Antifa guys, we need to push them both out to the margins of society instead of bringing one side in and delegitimizing another. That's just very dangerous for the country going forward. For people that hear the term narrative, it's not a simple thing to grasp beyond the fact that repetition and purposeful statements, factual or counterfactual, meaning true or not true, have this ability to penetrate into a society and to shape societal thinking. And so what we see is, by our enemy in this war, a deliberate and I believe purposeful attempt to marry our perception of who they are with, I'll call them, left-wing political narratives, terms like phobia. They know how to use terms that are common to Westerners to fulfill their objectives. So they put together a concept like, for example, Islamophobia. 15 years ago, we never heard the term Islamophobia. And we have to ask ourselves, where did that come from? And when you walk it back, you realize that Islamophobia is a term concocted by the generators of these narratives, oftentimes Muslim Brotherhood front organizations with groups like Council of American Islamic Relations or Muslim Public Affairs Council, who generate this term. But from their side, it's actually a weaponized version of what is in Islamic law, the law of slander, prohibiting any discussion of Islam that is critical of Islam. And so by doing this, you've collapsed our ability to do two things that are absolutely pivotal to Western civilization. Anybody who's spent time in the Middle East will recognize this. Critical thinking and reason do not exist in the Middle East as we understand them here. And the purpose of a term like Islamophobia is to enforce that Islamic law of slander on Westerners to shut down critical thinking and reason that would actually enable us to understand why the enemy fights, why Omar Mateen was drawn to, shoot 100 people, 49 of whom passed, at a nightclub in Orlando, Florida. It really isn't that difficult to understand once you start looking under the hood. But if the guy's telling you, you can't open the latch, you'll never know what's wrong with your car. I think we saw very purposefully, immediately after 9/11, Muslim Brotherhood entities identified and provided to, for example, the Society of Professional Journalists. So when the Society of Professional Journalists have an incident happen, they have a little caller list that was provided to them, and the organizations that they were directed to, if an incident happens and you need to find somebody inside the Muslim community to talk to, everyone they spoke to was Muslim Brotherhood. We see that at the political level, where our congressional members and in the executive branch, our senior general officers, our senior executives, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes the people that they are interfacing with are Muslim Brotherhood affiliated organizations. I tell people, Al-Qaeda, ISIS, they are not going to win the war on terrorism. The Muslim Brotherhood is going to win the war on terrorism. And I think if we can orient our intelligence processes and our thinking to understand how the Muslim Brotherhood is disrupting our thinking and disrupting the actions related to the way we conceptualize the fight, we'll understand this. Mr. Ackerman is unique in that he is a hardcore liberal media operative, was intimately involved in, I believe, the creation and certainly the management and execution of the Journalist, if you recall, the left-wing political journalism blog and listserv where they were synchronizing media stories back about 15 years ago. He, in 2011, writing for Wired.com, a know-nothing blog really, executed a series of stories targeting FBI training and later DoD training as it pertains to Islamic threat doctrines, effectively executing a purge through a partnership with this group, Muslim Advocates. What we saw happen was his first article was met with kind of a ho-hum. The second article, which expanded to include DoD and then was quickly followed up in succession by a letter from the head of Muslim Advocates for Kara, who was also in the testimony the other day at the U.S. Senate with Mr. Cruz, or Senator Cruz. And the timeline, I think, is the most important thing to understand, is that between the first article coming out and the purge being directed with a response from the White House, we're talking 5 weeks. And in government time, nothing happens in 5 weeks. Inside the Defense Department, where I was at the time, we saw the Joint Staff Directive come out, effectively telling us to purge intelligence, information operations, and what we call military information support operations, which is a euphemism for psychological operations. Effectively telling you the enemy knew that if we couldn't assess our enemy with intelligence, we could not communicate with him with information operations, we could not understand him on the psychological operations level, you have effectively collapsed our ability to understand what they're saying or to communicate back in any way. So whether or not Mr. Ackerman knew he was doing that, I can't prove that. I know the effect it had on the system, which was a complete and total shutdown of discussion of this. Inside the Department of Defense, you won't see slides that really ever talk about Islamic threat doctrine. What you'll see is the euphemism, violent extremism. And again, there's no such thing. I mean, you can't orient on a threat doctrine for violent extremism. It's purposefully gooey, and it will stay that way.
Political warfare is real warfare. That things that, there's a very small subset of the national security community that operates in this area. This is, black propaganda, psychological warfare, information warfare. And so what I was trying to do is present for, the president and his staff, an ontology, some way for them to understand what was happening to them beyond just them reacting to the political headlines of the day. And that got into, some of the specific tactics I knew we were seeing, right, where we had penetrations and subversion. We saw, a concerted propaganda campaign with the Russia hacked the election stuff. But to let them understand that there was a lot more organizational structure and decision making behind this that was obvious to somebody who knew what they were looking for. And in so doing, what I hoped to have them recognize is that there were countermeasures that they could put in place to deal with it.
Well, let's talk about just a second. You mentioned the term cultural Marxism. Mm-hmm. What does that term mean? Some people have heard it, but very few. What does it mean? Is it real? Give us some examples.
I think the simplest way to explain it to the layman who isn't familiar with it is the Marxists recognized that one of the real strengths in the West, particularly the Soviets, but others as well, that one of the real strengths of the West was our Judeo-Christian cultural basis. So what they knew is that to get to the United States, you didn't need to completely invert the United States. You needed to move it away from its true north, which was, the belief in God, the idea that every individual is created in the image of God. And from that basis, you begin moving them off of that. And so they got into cultural institutions, our music, our movies, our literature, our art. And in so doing, they don't necessarily have to completely deform it. They just have to deform it a little bit. It becomes much less resistant to the Marxist belief system at that point. And you've seen it over the years. It's very real. What I think people misunderstand is that there's a degree of intention behind it that, you simply adopt by participating, okay? And it's the nature of the design. There are a lot of people who are unwittingly Marxist, because of belief systems imparted upon them through the music they listen to, or the value systems that those arts that they, whether it be movies or whatever, that art that they watch inculcates them with. And it's slowly done over time. And what we see now is, 60 or 70 or 80 years, really 100 years, and, starting in 2017, 100 years on into the Marxist revolution, post-Soviet revolution, here we are, right? So I think for the average person, I don't want to complicate the idea. I mean, it's very simple. And I think one of the problems that we've had in the past is there's been a level of deniability afforded cultural Marxism, right? That's just conspiracy. You don't have to pay attention to that. Pull up something from the 1950s, an old TV show or movie. There are good guys and bad guys.
Oh, no question.
Good guys and bad guys, right? And then pull up a movie today.
But
right.
In the 1950s, though, I knew a man, I wasn't alive in the 50s, but I knew a man named W. Cleon Skousen, and I actually worked with him. My father worked with him, and he wrote a book, The Naked Communist, and he talked about all of these things in the 1950s. They got entered in the congressional record in the 1960s. You go back and read that, it's like a history lesson of exactly what's happened in the last 40, 50 years.
Right. Well, even today, you can pick up and you can read Manning Johnson to understand Black Lives Matter. I mean, there's nothing really new here. You go back and you listen to testimony from the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they talked about, labeling Americans as racist, and they talk about hating America firsters. I mean, it's the challenge we have is the cultural Marxism has been so effective at penetrating our educational institutions, to include our national security educational institutions, that most Americans, even professional trained Defense Department, military officers, intelligence officers, they don't know this stuff. The guys I learned this stuff from are all in their late 70s and early 80s, and functioned, operating against this adversary at the high levels in the Cold War.
Yeah.
There aren't many of them around today who really understand it at that level. I think the most important thing to understand about the publicity line of effort is that what you're providing in the publicity line of effort is a holding pen. It's a catch narrative that's propagated across mainstream media and social media that you're trying to drive people towards. A contemporary example of that is where Trump is you've seen it just in the past couple of days. Trump is a racist, right? Or Trump doesn't disavow white supremacy. That's how they're starting to move him in this direction. Then what you'll see is they'll have black propaganda, psychological war. A bunch of techniques will be deployed over the next several days to include using key influencers on the Republican side, which we see with John Roberts and others, that will be shaping people into that narrative stream. And these are really sophisticated psychological warfare techniques that, the average person just isn't exposed to.
But we know these, and you knew these when you were working inside the Department of Defense. You saw these being used in other countries, and now they're being used against us.
Right, exactly. That was the thing that was most shocking about everything, is that you've seen, in retrospect, you look back, and we didn't know we were looking at what is now known as Crossfire Hurricane and the FBI counterintelligence operation, although we could clearly see parts of the elephant. Now we have a much better picture of what was actually going on. I have to be honest with you, I still don't think we've seen all of it. I think there's a lot of more stuff that's still to be discovered, and I really hope that Attorney General Barr and Durham bring it forward to public light. I mean, we desperately need sunlight on this mess.